My name is Jerril Rechter and I'm the CEO of the Victorian Health Promotion Foundation, or more commonly known as Vic Health. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, pay my respects to elders past, present, emerging, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be here today. I do want to express my thanks to the conference organisers. This is a fantastic conference. We've already had such a wonderful morning. The next day and a half is just going to be wonderful, and I think you'll agree when you hear from all the speakers today that this also will be a fantastic session. Today's session on health and behavioural insights is designed to showcase the incredible breadth of activity and impact of behavioural insights on health and wellbeing. And events like this certainly vividly illustrate the strides behavioural insights has made across the globe. Behavioural insights highlights one of the essential components of the field that I work in, health promotion, that health happens everywhere. It's not just in hospitals, it's not just in community settings, it is everywhere. Indeed, the most effective health promotion strategies take place where people live, learn, love, work and play. Leveraging these insights we can garner by exploring human behaviour and understanding the way we make decisions really strengthens our opportunity to promote health and wellbeing and prevent chronic disease. And before I introduce our speakers, I'll just briefly share a little bit of Vic Health's experience in working in behavioural insights. Okay, so our journey in behavioural insights began 4 years ago when we first welcomed Dr. David Halpin, Chief Executive of the Behavioural Insights team, as Vic Health's inaugural leading thinker. I will just say I was out running through the foyer to get to the session today, and did you see the hot spots that were happening? David was standing there with a group of people who's like a Pied Piper. And I guess in some respects that's kind of what happened when we welcomed David to Vic Health. Behavioural Insights was incredibly new in Australia and in Victoria. And at the same time that the work was happening here in New South Wales, we were starting and commencing the work in Victoria. And we built on our innovation and research to promote health and wellbeing and prevent chronic disease. Now, for those of you that know a little bit about Vic Health, our very establishment back in 1987 on the back of tobacco tax was an incredible invention. And when we think about the impacts of our work, like long-term investments in tobacco control, they have certainly changed the health landscape in ways that we continue to see today. And in developing our action agenda for health promotion, which is our 10-year strategy, we identified BI as an incredibly integral way that we could accelerate our efforts to reach our goal of 1 million more Victorians with better health and wellbeing. Through our leading Thinkers initiative, we worked with David and his team to trial new approaches and focus our sights on enabling sustained health behaviour change through behavioural insights. We partnered with a range of organisations and a number of settings, including hospitals, sporting clubs, across regional Victoria and more. Highlights from the residency included Australia's largest citizens' jury on obesity, where close to 100 everyday Victorians delivered a consensus view on the 20 recommendations, or we called them asks, that if implemented by government, industry, civil society, community, would enable Victorians to eat better. A series of landmark behavioural insights trials, including a trial with Alfred Health that showed an increase in the price of sugary drinks by 20% in vending machines, resulted in the substitution of these drinks with healthier options with no loss of revenue to the machine operators. And that trial is now being rolled out across numerous health settings in Victoria, across sporting clubs and into community settings as well. So from the promising findings of our 7 trials and our citizens' jury, David's residency certainly propelled health promotion in Victoria into new and exciting territory. We learnt a great deal working with him, and I think that's part of the journey of behavioural insights, is the learning that you go on organisationally. We've certainly reinforced the notion that keeping people healthy is a far more cost-effective way than treating people when they are unwell. And 18 months ago, we commenced on our second Leading Thinker residency, once again with a focus on behavioural insights in order to cement it into our work. We are working with Professor Iris Bonet and Dr. Jenny Klugman, 2 people that you may know, and they're sharing our residency on behavioural insights and gender equality as foremost global experts on the topic. Iris is the Director of the Women in Public Policy Program at Harvard Kennedy School, the co-chair of the Global Behavioural Insights Network, and author of the book What Works? Gender Equality by Design. Jenny is the Managing Director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security, a Fellow at Harvard University's School of Women in Public Policy Program. And gender equality is a core principle of a fair, respectful, safe and inclusive society. And under the leadership of the Victorian Government and with many of our partners, through their commitment to building gender equality and preventing violence against women, the hard work I should also mention of the sector, particularly the women's health sector over many years, we are beginning to see those shifts in attitudes and a growing momentum for change across Victoria. Our work with our leading thinkers is focusing on shifting the drivers of gender inequality, including unconscious bias, gendered role models, stereotypes and social norms. And one exciting strand of work in gender equality are our forthcoming trials designed to shift bystander behaviour, or as we're starting to talk about it now, as upstanding behaviour. So individuals who witness or hear about sexism, discrimination and harassment are commonly referred to as bystanders. Proactive bystander action aims to shift the culture and includes challenging behaviour attitudes, practices or policies that contribute to sexism, discrimination or violence against women. Last year, we partnered with the Office for Prevention and Women's Equality, Deakin University and the Behavioural Insights team to understand with a much more sophisticated lens the latest evidence and its implications for bystander action. And because of this work, we now have the most up-to-date global research related to bystander action, with a focus that should be set on primary prevention of violence against women and family violence. And the report that is available on our website if you're interested. We're working with the Behavioural Insights team now to devise new approaches to encourage upstander action in the face of sexist behaviours and sexual harassment, and we're doing it in a tertiary education setting. Each new evidence-based initiative supports us all in our work towards what we're all hoping, which is a more just, healthy and gender equitable society. So we know that Behavioural Insights provides so many opportunities for all of us, and it has an incredibly positive impact. And I'm really excited to be hearing about the work of our speakers today. I've got great pleasure in introducing two of our speakers, if I may, just to start off with. The first speaker is Professor Brendan Murphy, the Chief Medical Officer of the Australian Government, and I'll do a follow-on introduction as well to Professor Michael J. Hiscox, who's the Clarence Dillon Professor of International Affairs in the Department of Government, Harvard University. So I'll just go back to Brendan. Along with his many roles at the Department of Health, Brendan is a professorial associate at Melbourne University and an adjunct professor at Monash University, a fellow of the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences, a fellow of the Royal Australian College of Physicians and the Australian Institute of Company Directors. He's also currently chair of the Antimicrobial Resistance Prevention and Containment Steering Group. For Michael, he is at Harvard and the founding director of the Sustainability, Transparency, Accounting and Research, or the STAR Lab. That's just a great name. It's kind of better than Beta in a way, isn't it? And is a faculty member of the Behavioural Insights Group at Harvard's Centre for Public Leadership. Now, while on leave from Harvard between 2015 and 2017, Michael was the founding director of the Behavioural Insights team, the Beta team in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet of the Australian Government, and he continues to serve as an advisor to Beta, and it's fantastic to have you back on home ground, Michael. But first of all, please join me in welcoming Brendan to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much for asking me to talk about a really important trial we've did, and one that has had exciting results in relation to the perennial problem of antimicrobial resistance. So a trial that was aimed to reduce probably our most difficult group of prescribers' prescription of antibiotics. So many of you in this room will know the problem of antimicrobial resistance. Essentially, the pharmaceutical companies are not producing new antibiotics. They're not commercially viable because you don't stay on them forever, thankfully. We're running out of antibiotics, and microbial organisms have this huge capacity to select for resistance and to spread that resistance amongst themselves. And we are now in a situation where there are many examples where people around the world have simply untreatable infections. They've closed transplant units in parts of the world. We have people occasionally, even in Australia, who have bugs that are infecting them that are essentially untreatable. And we know that all the data shows that the development of resistance is related to use, so that if you reduce the use of antibiotics, you reduce the incidence of resistance. Australia internationally is a high user of antibiotics, particularly in what we call community practice, so general practice, aged care. We have had significant reductions in the hospital sector due to some regulatory interventions which have been much more difficult to use in the community practice setting. Okay, so health in the role of the GPs is where we focus this trial on. GPs, 25,000 or so of them, prescribe the greatest proportion of antibiotics in our society. We know that probably close to half of the antibiotics prescribed, particularly for respiratory infections, viral respiratory infections, the common cold, the flu in well people, are of absolutely no value in treating those viral infections. Antibiotics work only for bacterial infections. Yet, GPs continue to prescribe very high levels of these antibiotics. We therefore know, as we saw in the hospital setting, that by reducing the GP prescription, we can directly impact antimicrobial resistance in our community, a very, very big problem. So why do GPs overprescribe antibiotics? It's probably because of a number of reasons. I think the main reason is that they feel that they will be judged for missing a bacterial infection and therefore will err on the side of overprescribing antibiotics. But at the moment there is no judgment, negative feedback or any form of approbation for prescribing an antibiotic which is not necessary. In fact, quite often the patients have been used to having antibiotics for these viral infections. They want them, they feel they're getting good treatment, getting a brightly coloured capsule for their cold and flu. So it's actually often harder for a GP to say no than it is to say yes. Particularly if you're dealing with very high throughput medicine, as many of them are, many of them will default to just giving the patient the antibiotic they want, not undergo the complicated discussion to explain to the patient why these antibiotics are of no value. We've tried a lot of educational materials and they haven't had much of an impact. GPs are busy people, they get lots of educational material. If you ask them, they say, yes, I know the data, antibiotics are overused and we shouldn't be using them in viral infections, but my practice is probably okay. I'm not a bad behaviour. So there's not a lot of evidence that those other educational interventions have reduced prescribing. So the behavioural economics team built on, and you'll hear more about the design later from Michael, on a successful approach in the UK where my counterpart, Dame Sally Davis, she likes being a dame, wrote a letter to the top prescribers of antibiotics in the UK NHS and achieved a 3% reduction over a sustained period, which was seen to be a reasonably good outcome. So in 2017, the clever people in our behavioural economics unit tried a similar approach, but also built into it the benefit of a randomised trial, which again you'll hear about later. But essentially we targeted the top 30% of prescribers, and the main power in this intervention was for most of the letters, it compared their prescribing to those of their peers, working on the premise that a big, powerful motivator, particularly of professionals like doctors, is peer comparison and being seen to be in line with their peers. They tested an education-only letter which didn't have any peer comparison as part of the suite, so that we could have a control group as well as a control group who got no letters at all. The letters, we just deliberately timed the letters to go out just before the cold and flu season, so about this time last year, where we know that there is always a peak in the antibiotic prescriptions in the community. So the strategies that were evaluated in this trial, and again we had some considerable discussion with the colleges and the AMA about whether the ethics of, and I think Cass talked about it this morning, of undergoing a randomised controlled trial without the GPs actually knowing they were in it, but it seemed ethically fine. All of the interventions were perfectly ethically acceptable. So we tested a number of different versions. One just had education material. One had peer comparison information just in a descriptive term. One had a very nice graph showing little bar charts of nicely coloured pills, attracting attention to the variance in prescribing behaviour. And one added in a strategy for GPs. One of the strategies that's been promoted is if you're not sure whether to give an antibiotic, you're not sure whether someone's got a bacterial infection, you say to the patient, here's a prescription, but hey, don't get it filled unless you get worse. If you're okay and don't get worse over the next few days, don't fill it. So that strategy was added in. So the results actually after 6 months were incredibly impressive. And I don't know whether there is a pointer here. Anyway, you can see the natural cyclical variation during the year where you have a huge spike right through from June through to October. And that happens every year in antibiotic prescribing in the community. The top graph was people, and these are only in these top 30% prescribers, was the group that had no letter. And that almost mirrored what you saw in the previous year. The next one just had that education material, you know, the usual story about how most antibiotics are not useful, antimicrobial resistance is a problem, and hey, why don't you think about not prescribing them? A modest impact. But all of the letters that had peer comparison had a very substantial impact. And you can see those three graphs at the bottom. One with just with the peer comparison and the graph. The blue one seemed to be the most effective, but all of the peer comparison ones had comparable effectiveness. A very substantial and arguably, certainly in the data set that we've got now, sustained reduction in prescribing. And looking at the numbers from the PBS data, we would estimate that the trial prevented 126,000 prescriptions for antibiotics from being written. So this, and you'll hear from Michael in a minute, this was an extremely effective intervention and approximately a 12% reduction at the end of that 6-month period, and hopefully that will be sustained. And that compares, as I said before, to a 3% reduction achieved in the UK. So you don't need to be a dame to have an intervention. I'll finish off before handing over to Michael with my little anecdote, which last year in November I went off to India on a holiday, and I went, and like all good docs, I have a GP to try and make me behave. So I trotted into my GP, he's a very good GP, and I said, Michael, I'm off to India, I want a box of azithromycin in case I get Delhi belly. He looked at me and he opened his drawer and he pulled out, I just had a letter from you. No. I said, you can write a private prescription and it won't be captured on the PBS and we'll never know. But anyway, so we were very excited at this stuff. And now Michael's going to come and tell you a bit about the science of the design and and the trial itself and give you more detail. And we'll have discussion later on. Thanks, Michael.
Let's see if I have more luck working the IT. Perfect. Okay, great. Terrific. It's a pleasure to be here and to report on the results of this trial. I think possibly it's my favorite trial that we began when I was director of Beta, and I should point out that it was a joint effort from the team at Beta and BERT, the Behavioural Economics Research team at the Department of Health. So we worked together on this trial, and I think it turned out to be a brilliant success. And the report, I hear, was just published on the Beta website, so it's publicly available now. So you go after this session, rush out. Don't do it while I'm talking. Go afterwards and look online, and you'll see the full report of the trial. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the theory, the behavioural theory underlying what we did, and then the design of the trial, and walk through the results one more time. The focus, as Brendan said, was on the possible importance of peer comparison. This is a sort of a fundamental aspect of being human, is that we take as a guide to how we should behave, how others around us, especially those that are similar to us, are behaving. And this sort of norm social norm or the compulsion to conform with what others are doing is a profound aspect of being human. We can think about what's driving this, and one theory is that it's about social pressure. It's about a desire not to be rejected, to be accepted by the group, and to fit with what the group is doing, to build group cohesion. There's a whole theory in evolutionary psychology about this. There's another more simpler one, which I tend to think is equally important, if not more important and prevalent here, and that is just it's an informational shortcut. In situations where we have to make lots of choices, what we call fraught choices, where there's a lot of uncertainty, we're facing stress, we're busy, we're harried, we need to make decisions, we look for shortcuts, ways to cut through that complexity, that cognitive effort, and make a reasonably good decision in a short amount of time. And what others are doing is a terrific heuristic or shortcut to doing that. This has been applied in lots of areas of policy, from helping people to understand how many people pay their taxes on time, to try and nudge them into paying their taxes on time, to seeing what other households do in terms of energy use, to try and nudge people towards energy efficiency at the household level. It's been very effective in these conditions. And then Brendan talked about the previous trials where this has been applied in exactly this context of doctors making prescriptions for antibiotics, giving them information about what their peers are doing in terms of prescribing, as a way to induce those who are over-prescribing, we think, to reduce their prescribing activities. We think this is especially effective, as we said, when people are making lots of choices, they're not getting much feedback on what others are doing. So this information is missing, essentially, from the choice architecture, and we can supply it. And it's very useful for people as a guide to appropriate behavior. So this is what we're trying to introduce in this system. As opposed to what they were able to do in the UK study, so there's a key difference what we think explains the size, the magnitude of our effect versus the effect that they found in the UK with the BIT study, is that they were only able to basically address prescribing at the level of the clinic, group level. So they could access and then supply information to doctors about the prescribing behavior at their clinic compared to other clinics. We were able to access very detailed data on individual GPs and how much they individually had prescribed, and compare that with their peers in the same areas of activity, in fact. So this gave us a great advantage in terms of what we were able to do in terms of the intervention. We think that at the group level, there's probably this mismatch in terms of accountability. I'm doing a good job, it's just my colleagues are over-prescribing. If I change my behavior, that's not going to have much of an effect because it's still all about my colleagues. So we think that at the group level, this kind of intervention is not going to be as effective. And that's part of why we tested this with our individual level data. Okay, let's move on. This is roughly what the letter looked like. All the letters with their peer comparison started with the letterhead of Brendan. So it's a Brendan effect that we're measuring here in some way. And then it was addressed to an individual doctor. I'm not a real doctor, I'm a fake doctor, I'm a PhD. But if I was practicing at PMC in Canberra, this is what the letter would have looked like for me. And the first line was, you prescribe more antibiotics than some number, percent, of prescribers in the area that I practice, the ACT. Right? This is a pretty intense treatment, I think, right? In terms of individual accountability and peer comparison. Right? And then Brendan mentioned the graphic, which we think makes this even more salient and hard to neglect, which is this one, this is a graphic depiction of how many more pills I put out there in the system compared to my peers who are practicing in the same area, same geographic location. So this is the peer comparison with the graphic that we designed to make the point or drive the point home. We did a couple of other things that we think are neat as part of this trial in terms of what we think are effective ways of communication that come out of the behavioral insights literature. So one is just like, a message is going to be, the importance of a message is going to be related to the messenger. So having the message come from a very credible and trustworthy authority figure like Brendan, we think is critical in this. The messenger matters. The timing matters. So having this come out just with the onset of the flu and cold season is important because this is top of mind for doctors. They're going to get more patients coming in asking for antibiotics. This is the right time to send out this kind of message. And then salience is critical. So as Brendan said, doctors get a wealth of mailings and information pouring in. There's a lot to sort through cognitively, it requires a lot of effort. So we needed our message to cut through, to grab attention. That first line in the peer comparison letter grabs your attention immediately. The graphic is hard to forget. Right? So we think these are key salience cues that grab people's attention and drive the point home. Okay, the design of the trial looks roughly like this. We started with GPs with good individual data on prescribing going back 2 years, about 22,000 of those. We sifted out and took the top 30% of prescribers in each of the geographical areas that we defined as, I think it's the ABS level 4. So this is basically sub-state regions of about 100 to 300,000 people. We have the top 30% of prescribers, about 6,500 of them. These are clustered into a little over 3,000 clinics. So this is a randomized cluster design. We wanted to do the clustering because we know that doctors in the same practice will share information. We didn't want different letters or treatments going to doctors in the same practice where they might compare the letters and say, hey, what's going on here? Brandon is trying to pull a fast one on us. And we get what we call spillover or interference effects in a trial. So we clustered by clinic. And then we had 5 control groups. We had a pure control group that received no communication at this time from the CMO. We had our education letter only that Brendan described with the basic information about the problem and what they could do. And we had our education letter where we added the tagline at the start about how you compare with your peers. And then we had the one with the delayed scripts, advice, and a plan for how to do that with the stickers. And then we had our killer app, which we think is the peer comparison with the graphic showing how you compare in terms of the little stack of pills. About 640 clinics in each of these experimental groups, about 1,300 doctors in each of these groups. This is my favorite, I think my favorite chart of any paper I've ever written. Brendan got to put it up. I think this is just an awesome chart. It's so pure in terms of the effect. So we were able to follow individual doctors who are part of our trial back 2 years in the data and map their prescribing behavior. And we can show how the experimental groups are identical, right? The randomization works. We have identical groups of GPs in terms of prescribing behavior over time. We just ran this back a year, and then boom, something remarkable happens when our letter goes out. Suddenly they diverge, and in a major marked way. So we have the control group, which just, as Brendan said, just follow the usual cyclical pattern in terms of prescribing. We have the group that got the education letter, where there's some effect, not dramatic, but there's some effect in terms of reducing prescribing behavior. And then we have our groups that had the peer comparison. And here we have major reductions in prescribing immediately that persist at 6 months. Right? This is a dramatic effect from a simple letter that costs almost nothing to send out. Right? This is the static comparison over the 6 months from when the letter went out in terms of average prescribing among GPs in each experimental group. So we have our control group here, which is about 109.3 scripts per 1,000 consults in the 6-month period. This is the group that got no letter. This is the education only group that just got the letter with the general information about the problem, what they could do. So we get about 3.2% reduction here, which is roughly what the biggest effect that the UK trial got. And now all our peer comparison groups, and this is our largest effect for the group that got the peer comparison in words with the graphic as well. A 12.3% reduction in prescriptions across a 6-month period. So a massive effect. Since we're talking about peer comparison, I'll just emphasize again that the UK study got 3.3% and we got 12. This is a bit more of a dynamic graphic of the effects. So one of the things we're always interested in with behavioural trials is whether or not the intervention, the effect persists over time or does it wear off? Right? Sort of what's the sustainability or durability of the effect? So we can plot this basically month by month. What's the difference in prescribing behavior among the GPs in each experimental group? So we plotted this as a difference from the control. So we just set the prescribing in each month, the rate for the control group, and then we look at the reduction in prescriptions on average in each experimental group. So here we can see that we had dramatic, immediate effects of letter going out for our peer comparison groups, especially here. So we have reductions of a little over 16, I think 17 scripts per 1,000 consults in our biggest biggest effect here, which is fairly dramatic. This is at 1 and 2 months out from the letter, but this persists pretty well even at 6 months. We have a fairly large reduction in scripts even at 6 months. So we see a fall off in the effect, but it lasts a long time, and we can go back and keep measuring how long it's lasting. And then we have this issue, this wonderful issue of like, do we refresh this? Do we institutionalize this kind of feedback to make sure that it's sustained over time? Will people get tired of it? That's another question. Will they become resistant to it? Is another question. So these are all great follow-up research questions, but the effect is dramatic but also lasting. So that's encouraging. This is another way of slicing the data, just to think about, we designed this, I didn't mention this, but we designed this with pre-randomization matching so that we can create basically strata of our subjects in our trial based upon their characteristics, the size of the clinic, the type of area that they're working in, other characteristics, their previous prescribing behavior. So we can separate out the highest prescribers in our data. So the top 15% of the top 30% as our highest prescribers in terms of previous prescribing, and see if the effect was more dramatic among them than among the others that we have, those in the 70th to the 85th percentile. So this is what we've done in the data here. We've just, we have just separated out the highest prescribers, the top 15% here, and looked at the effect of all the peer comparison ones. We pulled all the peer comparison experimental groups here into one effect, again, in terms of a reduction in prescriptions compared to the control. And here is the group that are high prescribers, but they're just not the worst perpetrators, as it were, the highest prescribers. So as expected, and I think as encouraging, is that where we reduced prescription most was among the top end, the most extreme GPs out there in terms of prescribing behavior. The letters had the largest effect on them. And they got the letter that said, you're prescribing more than 95% of people in your area, right? So it's a very dramatic dosage, if you like, of the treatment. So there, the effect was bigger. So that fits with our expectations. We also have some different results in terms of the socioeconomic characteristics of the areas in which the doctors work. We found a larger effect in those areas that had lower socioeconomic status scores defined by the ABS, which is interesting. So what the trial seemed to do was to equalize prescribing rates across the areas a bit more from poorer to richer. It had a larger effect in reducing prescriptions in the areas that are less well off socioeconomically, which is interesting. They tend to have a higher rate of prescribing in the control condition, which is interesting as well. We can talk about that more perhaps in Q&A. All right, so I think this is, as I said, one of my favorite trials ever. I think with an intervention that costs nothing, just requires us to build the structure to analyze the data and then send out that data as feedback to doctors to help guide their decisions. We got a huge impact in terms of behavior that affects a major health problem, right? And so I think as we replicated the UK study, we built upon it with individual level data and got even bigger effects. So for me, I think this is just one more demonstration of the power of behavioral insights to design very simple, very straightforward interventions that work incredibly well, and the power of a well-designed trial to demonstrate and measure what works, and in fact, what works best in this instance. So I wanted to congratulate the teams for working on this. I think it's a great trial, and I'm happy to talk about it more in the Q&A. Thanks.
You shouldn't do that. It was really fantastic to see the results of the trial, and also wonderful to see the comparison with the UK, and that we were able to go that next level down in terms of detail, and that was what had the incredible effect in terms of the peer comparison. And that strong line graphic, that grabbing attention graphic and the one line, it certainly would make you sit up without a doubt, and obviously it did. So thank you both to Brendan and Michael for sharing that trial. As Michael mentioned, we will be having a Q&A, and we would like it to be incredibly interactive. So as the next speaker is speaking, pay attention, but also start to think about some of the questions you might like to ask some of the panel. But I would now like to introduce our next speaker, Associate Professor Jerril Rechter from the school, from the Susan Waakes School of Nursing and Midwifery, University of Sydney. She was the inaugural chair of the Collaboration on Social Science in Immunisation and is a visiting senior research fellow at the National Centre for Immunisation Research and Surveillance. She's also a member of the Tailoring Immunisation Program Advisory Group of Experts for the WHO European Office. In 2015, Julie won the Public Health Impact Award and the Sachs Institute Research Action Award. Please join me in welcoming Julie to the lectern. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jerril. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me. It's a real privilege. Okay, I want to start with the values proposition of vaccination and remind you all of what vaccines bring us. First of all, the eradication of a whole disease, smallpox, that killed up to 30% of its victims. In 1980, it was eradicated. Polio still remains in a handful of countries. There are occasional setbacks, but we look to be eradicating polio from the planet within the next few years. It's hard to predict exactly when, but polio was a disease that put children in iron lungs in great numbers, like this in this slide from California in the 1950s. And now the iron lung is a feature of often just a museum, and in fact this is from the British Museum. We've got some challenges though. We've got a number of claims that are made about vaccination in the public arena. For example, that vaccines cause all manner of modern ills, that they are full of toxic chemical cocktails. Claims that people, have something go wrong with their child and they believe it's a vaccine and they produce heart-wrenching personal testimony. This idea that the denial of vaccines being unsafe is like the denial that cigarettes were unsafe, and anti-vaccination movements who are extremely active online. And into the mix we have the President of the US, who himself is vaccine hesitant. We also have an increasingly crowded schedule. This is from 1974, and it's our immunisation record. This is 2018, and there's a number of vaccines. The schedule has certainly increased and is more crowded than it's ever been before, but that's a good news story, of course, because we have more people who are offered protection against a greater number of diseases. With vaccination, our desired behaviours are to vaccinate on time and for people to receive all appropriate vaccines in both children and adults and adolescents. But our vaccination rates in some age groups are suboptimal. So this is from a colleague of mine, Rob Menzies, showing that in the sort of the red colour, that's the proportion who are fully vaccinated for age, and in the blue, those who are under-vaccinated, so not up to date or completely unvaccinated. And you can see there, the over 65s, we've got a way to go with improving coverage for adults. So there's a lot of focus on children. Children are important, and they need to have the primary vaccines, and they need to have those in high proportions. The target is 95%, particularly with prevention of measles. But adults are also important, as are adolescents. So our coverage rates are actually quite high and stable for children, but there's this persistent gap. Who's in the gap? And this is a slide from Hal Willoughby, who's in the audience from Colosum Consulting, and he was working with me, so acknowledgements to Hal for this graphic. So you've got 92% fully vaccinated when we're able to make these estimates. In 2014, it's a little bit higher now, it's 94%. And in that gap are those who lack opportunity and capability. So these are your single parent families, your larger families, your disadvantaged families, your families where the child is born overseas and they're yet to catch up on our schedule. These are not motivational problems. And then you've got families where there's a lack of acceptance of vaccination. And we estimated at the time that the proportion was about 60-40. So even though the major message around vaccination is that it's people actively choosing not to vaccinate, in fact, it's really the social determinants of vaccination that remain our biggest barrier. So what about that group who lack opportunity? It's really interesting because if you look at the interventions that improve vaccination coverage, what you find is that they appear to be targeting those people who are motivated or fairly motivated but just can't get to the vaccine on time for a variety of reasons. And this is work we did a few years ago, well, we've done over a couple of years, and we've published just this year, looking at interventions that have evidence that that you can have an impact on behaviour in other areas, and looking at what sort of potential impact there is with vaccination. And also, this slide set is actually slightly outdated. The one I sent isn't the one that's here, so I'm just winging it a little bit here, but I will tell you that incentives and requirements and healthcare provider recommendations come with good evidence in both other areas of behaviour and with vaccination. I'll point to another couple of things here: reminders and recalls and implementation intentions. And if you have a look at the booklet that's available to you, you'll see some nice examples of that from Victoria, where there was the Behavioural Insights work to improve HPV vaccination uptake. And that was capitalising on both of these things: reminders, recalls and implementation intentions. I want to give you a really nice example of where this helped close the gap in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander immunisation in New South Wales. So in 2012, New South Wales implemented a program to put an Aboriginal person in each public health unit to work with the local community to improve vaccination rates within that community or those communities. And what they did was that they made sure that if you were Indigenous, you were notified on our Australian Immunisation Register. They, in some places, did pre-calls, so phoning or SMSing somebody ahead of time so that they were reminded that their child's vaccination was due in a week. Enabling families to get to access the service, and also promoting vaccination within their communities, so that capitalising on the social norming. And you see there, it is aggregate data, it's not a trial, but it's very promising to see that closing and even reversing of the gap in childhood vaccination rates in New South Wales. So that's a really nice example of a multifactorial intervention to help close an important gap. So I've mentioned this lack of opportunity. What about lack of acceptance? These people are harder to reach, and as Hal used to say to me, it's hard to change psychological barriers. It's harder to change those barriers than it is to change the practical barriers when there's motivation. We've been doing a lot of work with these groups, thinking carefully about how to minimise this problem. And I've got here 3 major reasons why parents decline vaccination, because that helps us understand the audiences that we're trying to reach, and sometimes to realise that we can't reach them as well in some instances. So those who have had some kind of bad experience with the healthcare system, those who are simply vigilant and are practising intensive parenting in all spheres of their child's upbringing, and those who are alternative and have alternative approaches to life in general. So read this quote. This mum that we interviewed in Adelaide said, "I grow vegetables, I have chickens, I feed my children organic food, I cook everything from scratch. I don't give them processed food, we have no chemicals in the house, we don't drink fluoridated water. So why would I then go and put all those chemicals in the vaccine into my child?" It's going to be really hard to get this mum to change her mind, because this is consonant with a whole value system. So we've got to think about who we're working with. And one of the things we want to do is to prevent a vaccine safety scare, which we will have again inevitably, from causing a downturn in vaccination rates like this. So, you know, in other words, probably targeting the hesitant so that they don't become the vaccine refusers of tomorrow. And the blue bars represent the declining vaccination rates after Andrew Wakefield published his Lancet paper in '98 alleging that the MMR vaccine causes autism. That particular scare caught fire in the UK, reduced vaccination rates, and the predictable happened, which was an epidemic of measles, and they continue to struggle with measles to this day, now 20 years later. So how do we reach those who refuse vaccination? Can we? Why is it important? Well, one of the things we're doing is paying attention to communication science. One of the things that's very common among the well-intended is to try to debunk myths about vaccination by reciting the myth up front and then correcting it with facts underneath. So in this case, false, vaccination can cause autism, and then you get all the facts. Communication science, which looks at debiasing, looks at cognitive bias and looks at how to work around that, suggests, and this is from the wonderful Debunking handbook, and many of you will be familiar with this kind of work, that if you try to debunk a myth and lead on the myth, then you get this potential familiarity backfire effect. The two concepts, autism and vaccines, are co-located in the one sentence, and the negation tag, the not, falls off with time. A second thing can happen when those already have a strong existing view about vaccination in this case, and we try to give them facts that make most of us decide to want to vaccinate even more. These people become less inclined towards vaccination, the worldview backfire effect. And these authors suggest you need to debunk, well, fill the cognitive kind of vacuum you create when you say that something like vaccines don't cause autism. So we attempted to do this with some materials that we produced. We led with without repeating the myth. We asked a question. We avoided putting the word vaccine next to autism in this main headline. We did have it here with our core fact. We explained the core fact, how do we know that vaccines don't cause autism? And then we filled the gap. Well, what do we know causes autism at the moment? Of course, there's a lot of uncertainty there, so we had to acknowledge that. Then we talk about the myth itself and where it came from. We try not to play the opponent, we play the issue, and we acknowledge our funding source and the people who wrote this and our qualifications. We use moderate language in the slogan. We give other levels of information and an evidence base. So what we're trying to do here is follow some rules around debunking. It's not perfect. We're still updating this information, but it's certainly a genuine start. But we need to go beyond the pamphlets because it's not really about what you communicate. It's how you communicate, whether you're trustworthy and so forth. And we know that dismissive communication is associated with non-vaccination, but that good communication can move people towards vaccination. And in this study, this was with non-vaccinators who'd moved towards vaccination, had decided to vaccinate, having not, and it showed that information or assurances from a healthcare provider were the main self-reported reason for them deciding to vaccinate. So we have decided to focus our efforts in developing intervention to address parental hesitancy about vaccination, so targeting the fence sitters, the people in the middle. With this intervention, Hal was involved in the original development, which helps providers, the professionals who give vaccination, to mentally sort whether somebody is ready to vaccinate, whether they're hesitant, or whether they're not going to vaccinate, where you've got that risk of the worldview backfire effect if you try and convince them. And we have specific appropriate goals. We have resources that support that conversation and tailored strategies. And in the lovely updated version, I was going to show you the strategies, but you can ask me afterwards. So one of the, I guess, the sort of core ways in which we advise and we place sort of communication nudges into this communication framework is by making sure that we have when somebody is very hesitant about vaccination, that they elicit all the questions and concerns before they jump in and answer those questions and concerns. So it's about resisting the writing reflex. It's about setting an agenda, and there's a lot of great work that's been done overseas in agenda setting in clinical communication that is effective and doesn't necessarily take more time in the conversation. Sharing knowledge, including taking elements of motivational interviewing into this conversation, amplifying a potential existing motivation to vaccinate, recommending, because the evidence says that recommendations are very important, and planning and closing and not abandoning parents who are hesitant or not going to vaccinate to their decisions, but keeping them coming back, keeping them reviewing their decisions. Some change their minds. And we have resources to support those conversations and a referral system as well when it gets all too difficult or there's an adverse event that has influenced the parents' hesitancy. So looking forward, improving adult coverage, immunisation coverage, as you saw earlier, is really important. And there are a number of at-risk groups who still have to pay for catch-up vaccines, but where free catch-up vaccines would create significant disease control with targeting those particular groups. So removing the cost barrier is very important. More interventions to address barriers to opportunity and capability. So, we've got a national registry in Australia, so reminders and recalls, there is capacity to do that. For acceptance, recognising that the facts alone are not enough, that behavioural and communication science has much to offer. And we really, in our policy and planning, we really need to pay attention to that, and it could certainly happen more. Preventing hesitancy from becoming refusal. Communication plans for safety events. Working with providers, communities and schools, and funding, sustaining and building on a body of knowledge in the social science of vaccination is absolutely vital if we're going to have resilient programs that pay attention to what behavioural insights tell us. Thank you very much.
Just want to grab a seat, Julie. That's great. Thank you so much, Julie. An incredibly complicated space to be working with all of those outside forces pressing down on you. And I actually hadn't seen that graphic of the cigarette pack with the syringes. That's a very powerful graphic, actually. We've got a wonderful opportunity now to have some questions, and there is a person with a microphone up the back of the room, and we are straight into the questions. So I've got some backup ones here, but I love that we're going there. I feel like I'm at an auction, So please make sure that when you stand up and introduce yourself as well to the panel. Thanks.
My name's David Tunnicliffe. I have a company called Grey Matters. And just tangentially, I did some qualitative research for NPS on this whole background of the antibiotic. It's good to see some of those themes popping up and being actioned. But I wondered, Michael, just for the fun of it, did you drop in any letters to those doctors who were behaving themselves to see whether there was an upsurge in their behaviour, in their prescribing behaviour? Or did you not want to go there at all?
We did not want to go, I'll answer, we did not want to go there, but I've seen some trials, obviously. You're probably aware of some trials, sort of famously one on energy consumption, where the feedback was to individuals or members of households who were doing quite well compared to their peers in terms of energy use. They were much lower than the average of households in their zip code in the US. And in the subsequent month, the energy use went up, right? Which is what we would predict. And so we did not want to induce more prescribing among those who are actually lower than the average in terms of prescribing. But I think we would have got that effect if we'd done it.
We'll make our way back down the room. One over here and then to your left after this next question.
Kim Connolly, Comcare. I know you covered it, but I just wanted to raise it and hopefully get a bit more discussion about it. There's a theory in that don't target in your case, the high prescribers, the ones that have got because their behaviour is entrenched. Target the ones that are in the mid-range, so you might be able to influence. So it's a bit similar to what Julie's raised in her trial, and I'd like your opinion on that.
I'll fire away. I think it's so context specific, I think, in terms of the actual behaviours that we're talking about. So I've encountered that kind of context before. I've done some work on prisoner counselling and prisoner through care programs, for example, and the issue of recidivism. And so there's a lot of discussion in that domain, essentially, about hardened criminals or long-term prisoners and the chances of inducing behavioural change among them that would lower recidivism versus first-time offenders who've only been in jail a short time. And we would imagine that an intervention targeted at them that was about, was cognitive behavioural therapy or counselling may be more effective, and so we should target it there, right? So there's lots of discussion, but I think it's so specific to the particular behaviour that we have in mind, and then associated with that is the type of intervention. So a peer comparison, if we imagine that what's going on here is that doctors are making choices, they don't have a benchmark for their choices, they're making them for all the reasons that Brendan outlined. The patients are demanding something, it improves their relationship, they're not keeping front of mind the long-term problems of antimicrobial resistance, then this is an intervention that gives them that information that's missing, that gives them a benchmark and a reason to change. So I think in this particular context, targeting the top prescribers was entirely appropriate with that intervention, but there are other contexts in which we wouldn't imagine that a simple behavioural intervention might be as effective for the kind of extreme cases versus some middle range group. That makes sense.
I might just add something. I think in this particular context, these guys many of them had no idea that they were in that high prescriber. But it's not entrenched behaviour. It's in fact they're living in an information vacuum. Yeah. And I mean, my own GP, he's a very good GP, and a lot of these, I had a lot of letters, trying to explain away their prescribing practice, and it was a very powerful insight for these people. We're not like sending a letter to an entrenched anti-vaxxer. This is someone who really didn't know that in many cases, that they were out of the norm.
Are there complementary interventions being undertaken in AMR that could help reduce this even further that you know of?
Well, I think Michael alluded to how can we mainstream this. I mean, the way we did it in hospitals was, say, Australian Council on Healthcare Standards introduced a standard that said you had to have antimicrobial stewardship or else you'd fail your accreditation. So when I was a hospital CEO, I had to go and hire another bloody ID physician, otherwise I would have failed accreditation. And it was a priority for management. And hospitals now have entrenched antimicrobial surveillance and stewardship. So the doctors have real-time feedback. Now, what we need to do is to try and get up systems in general practice because they've all got electronic prescribing systems. The data is there. It's just a matter of mainstreaming it and making it a priority for them, and to get a quality culture where they review their own data. Because almost every doctor wants to do the right thing. So I think and we're looking at that in our primary care reform strategy. At the moment, we have a primary care system that rewards 7-minute high throughput medicine, and doesn't have any particularly good rewards for quality and reflective practice.
There's a question just on your right here. Hand up, yep.
My name's Shireen Jackson. I'm from NPS Medicine Wise, which I think just got referred to by the gentleman down here. In 1998, when I was obviously very, very young, my first job at what was then the National Prescribing Service was crafting up these peer comparison graphs, as
Yes.
you showed here,
Yes,
the letters.
yeah.
And we've been doing that for 20 years over a range of topics, 2 and 3 times a year. So I was just sitting here thinking, oh, this is really exciting. Because you talked at the end of your presentation about, is this sustainable, is this transferable to a broader range of medicines and medical tests? And we believe our evaluation that we've done on these shows that it is. So it's probably not more a comment than a question. And how can we get together and look at that work you're currently doing and look at that long history of data and evaluation that NPS has been working with general practice, and bring that together in a really meaningful way. And adding to that the data insights, because we collect data from general practice as well now, and how can we even strengthen that intervention even further, so it's more an opening to say how can we bring these things together and not keep reinventing the wheel, but make the best of the learnings from both pieces of work.
Absolutely. Just a quick comment on that. We did talk to the NPS as we were designing this, and I think we even negotiated a short pause, or we timed our intervention so there was a pause between the usual letters that go out by the NPS that had this peer comparison built in. And we have been talking about a quasi-experimental analysis of the data going back in time to see if we can match the timing of the NPS communications with subsequent prescribing behaviour, which I think we can do with the data. So that's right.
To your left at the end of the row.
Hello, I'm Jennifer Rayner from the ACT government. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot today, as we've been hearing from the different researchers, is whether something that has been tried works on the same person more than once. So we know very broadly in social research that behaviours tend to be fairly sticky and people do lapse back into the negative behaviour over time. In an instance like the antibiotic prescribing case, where the effect might persist over time, but eventually doctors may go back to doing what we didn't want them to do you think that approaches like the one that you've had can work repeatedly on people, or do you have to keep coming back and trying something different every time?
Yeah, this is a great question. We get this a lot, and it's a really good question. Unfortunately, I think the answer is not clear, and hence we need more testing. But there are sort of two schools of thought. One is a sort of a skeptical marketing perspective that says, like, look at what the private sector does. Like, it reinvents branding and communications like every quarter probably about a product. And the assumption is that you need to keep grabbing attention. So you can't just have the same message because people go numb to it. So you have to keep having something new about the chocolate or the jeans or whatever it is that is new and fresh. But there's been some evidence that that people respond continually to a behavioural nudge that is effective over and over again, even if it doesn't change. So reminders are like that, because reminders are very, very useful. So even though you might say, oh yeah, this is the reminder, I've got that before, it still works because people go, and actually, yeah, that's good, now I'll make the call. Or, yeah, my appointment's tomorrow, right, okay, good. We don't know what the peer comparison one is like, I think, essentially. So we can run that test where we redo the letters or the communication in another form, maybe through NPS, and see whether or not people go numb to it, or whether in fact they use it as a useful reminder or guidance. And they can say, hey, look, my numbers have come down, I'm doing better, I'm making progress. Right? So if it's a useful thing that people can help, they can realize that it's a decision aid, I think they won't go numb to it, they'll keep responding to it.
Certainly with vaccination, there's new cohorts, all the time, so it's not so much of an issue of fatigue, message fatigue.
Right.
Hi, Kaji from the Department of Home Affairs. My question is similar. It's after you've done the trial and you've seen the results, do you write to any of the people that actually moderated their behaviour to validate that they made a good choice, that they now fall into the beneficial range, the one that you're aiming for? Particularly if you can validate their change and that generates sustained change?
I think that may be a question for Brendan in that sense.
We were
positive,
just debating that question. We had a little session with Cass at lunchtime today. I was just saying whether some doctors might see that as patronising, you're a good lad or a good girl for doing it. Some might see it as a really reinforcing thing. We're just thinking that through at the moment because it is a really important question. Just back to the other, we can test. We've just sent out letters to the top narcotic prescribers in the country, and I've had a few interesting responses from that one too. But it'll be interesting to see whether another campaign, which is very similar, coming from me, within 12 months, has the same impact. Now, obviously, it's a different sort of circumstance, but and there's been an interesting reaction from some of the medical groups, the AMA and the college, who supported both campaigns, are now backing away a little bit from this narcotic one because there's a bit of reaction in their group. So I think we've now created ourselves a problem in thinking about what is our next step. Do we? Because it's been so successful. If we only had a 3%, we would have said publish your paper and let's keep on with our big. But this is now something that it opens up for us a real opportunity to build on it, and I don't think we've analysed or got the next step planned.
Continuing going back down the room.
Hi, it's Henry Cutler from the Centre for the Health Economy. So I really like your charts and I really like the reduction in prescribing, but of that behaviour, some of it would be unwarranted and some of it may have been warranted, i.e. they've stopped prescribing to people that deserved antibiotics. How do you nuance that? How do you nuance the change in behaviours, and how do you develop something that ensures some of that wanted behaviour remains and that unwanted behaviour is removed?
I suppose the reduction we saw was still a reduction above average. We weren't reducing them below, what was a seemingly reasonable. Now you have to assume that their discernment was such that they weren't they weren't thinking about, is this a viral respiratory infection, that they were just sort of so frightened that they stopped prescribing altogether. I mean, that's always a concern that the GPs will say to me is, well, it's much better to err on the side of caution. And if I have a really tricky sore throat, and we always say, well then, do the delayed prescribing, or if you think there's a strong likelihood it's bacterial, please don't hold back. But if you talk to these doctors, most of them have the cognitive ability to pick a viral respiratory infection from a bacterial one. Obviously it's something you'd want to monitor, but I don't think we're reducing them down to anything that's an unreasonable level of prescribing.
Hi, Juliet, Behavioural Economics team at Commonwealth Bank. First of all, I should say both talks were really interesting. And Julie, I liked the idea of, stopping kind of feeding these fallacies or the myths in terms of reinforcing it. My question is around the letters. How do we know that it's not just people feeling tracked as opposed to responding to the social norms? And then, Brendan, your story got me thinking about how are you thinking about some of the spillover effects in terms of, are people just now using a private prescription, or is there people that should be receiving the antibiotics that aren't, which you sort of just touched on?
Of a private prescription one, we haven't seen. We can get evidence from the pharmacy guild and the pharmaceutical suppliers on that. We're not seeing a lot of evidence of that. The reason they probably won't do private prescriptions is the electronic software that they use that rolls defaults. We know that if the default is for one repeat prescription, they'll always give it, even without thinking it. So now we're actually removing the repeat prescription, trying to change the software. So you'd have to make a special effort to do a private non-PBS prescription, and we haven't seen any evidence of that. I don't think most of these people. I think the vast majority of them, certainly the ones I've talked to, and I've talked to a lot of people because they often ring me, when they get these letters, they feel that this is a good thing and it's reflective, and that they really want to change their practice. So those are all risks, but we haven't seen any evidence that that's happening.
Did you want to answer anything, Julie, add to it?
No, but I was in a recent forum where the repeat prescription was an important change, so it's great to hear that is changing.
Just on the letters, there's a really good question about how do we know it's about peer comparison versus just knowledge of being tracked. We don't have the chart up, but you can see there's actually a decent difference between the peer comparison letters. Certainly our best performing one, which had the chart, which made it really salient and apparent where you fit in terms of your peers, versus the one that was just the single line with the education message afterwards. So we think that in both of them, it's clear that they're being tracked. But the one that accentuated the peer comparison the most had the largest effects. We think actually the doctors know that prescription levels are being monitored or tracked because it's in the system. This may be accentuating it. The cool one would, which we couldn't do, would be to, I think, to publish the information about their prescribing generally, to emphasise the fact that they're being tracked and this is being recorded, or there are league tables that show how their clinic is doing, or how they individually are doing in terms of addressing the crisis. That would accentuate the tracking, the sense that they're being tracked, and that information has become public actually. I don't think we could do that trial, but I think it would be very effective.
Brendan still wants his job for a little bit longer. More questions up the back. We have one on the far right.
Hi, Saskia Lewis from Return to Work SA. I just wanted to ask about the intervention chosen. Obviously, you targeted the prescribing doctor. Was there any consideration given to look at the top consumers of antibiotic medication, more so from the perspective of then a vaccination program that would look at the consumer and targeting the consumer rather than the prescriber?
Yeah, we did talk about that quite a bit. The trial that was done in the US, and the UK trial actually had a consumer side to it as well, which was posters put up in clinics to try to, as people were waiting, they could see information saying, please don't basically insist on getting antibiotics from your doctor, because in most cases it's not necessary. I can't remember what the text was, but they had a sense that maybe you can address this from the consumer side, in the sense that people can be made more aware that what they have may not be effectively addressed with antibiotics, and they shouldn't be urging their doctor to give them a script. The results from that trial, I think, indicated that it made things worse. So it put antibiotics front and center on people's minds, and it made it more likely that they would go in and more likely they'd get a script. So we decided not to try to tackle that in this trial. But I think it's a critical one, and it goes to the issues that Julie was talking about education and how you basically explain to people who have doubts about technical and scientific explanations for different treatments, to make it, bring up their awareness and improve the sort of way that they respond to recommendations from doctors and the system itself.
There's one at the very far right.
Thanks. John Gorvet from the South Australian Government. Brendan mentioned the narcotics issue, which is obviously different, but I was just wondering on that whether, out of all the focus and the work in the US around narcotics, whether there are any other examples of interesting BI approaches that have been seen to be working around opioids and narcotics that we should be aware of.
Well, I think, we're actually quite worried about we're not, if you look at the graphs of the US experience, we're sort of a bit over halfway there, or 3/4 of the way. We have a significant emerging problem, so there's a whole lot of things being done. So the first one was the upscheduling of low-dose codeine medicines, which was, an incredibly contentious issue. And now we're very clearly focusing on the prescription narcotics for non-cancer pain. And we're looking at a range of other initiatives like, often when you get discharged from hospital after your hip replacement, you get a box of 30 oxycodone when you really only need it for 2 days. So, pack sizes. We're looking at one of the biggest scourges is fentanyl patches, which are being widely used for non-cancer pain and really are very dangerous, and whether we should put some further limits on those. It's very dependent on state and territory poisons legislation. There's a lot of action in this space now. One of the challenges that we have is that if we sort of take away the source of semi-addiction to narcotics, and then we don't have good strategies globally to address chronic non-cancer pain, we've got to try and make sure that we also invest in those strategies, because these people need help, and you end up, if you take away what sort of they believe has kept them going. We've seen interesting stories in the media recently about people who have kicked their low-dose codeine addiction after the up-scheduling, and some really good stories, but access to those things are really challenging.
There's a couple of things going on I know about in the US. In California, I think that there's one that's quite controversial, I think called the Death Diaries one, and there's another where basically they try to feed back to doctors when somebody dies of an addiction and that doctor has prescribed them opioids. They give that information back to doctors saying this patient just died of an overdose or opioid-related problem. You're on the list of the doctors that gave them a prescription. It was pretty intense.
More questions. There was some, we came back down to the front again. We'll do one on the aisle and then one down the front here.
Rachel Feenan, Queensland Health. I just have a question in relation to the antibiotics and real-time monitoring that you mentioned happens in hospitals versus a community-based targeted approach, and how effective each were compared to if there's any use of self-monitoring.
Yeah, so real-time monitoring obviously is something in community pharmacies we nationally are looking at in narcotics. I don't think, it's quite a... Again, the systems are there, but there's been no development work in doing real-time monitoring of antibiotic prescribing in the community setting. It's something you could theoretically do, but the investment at the moment's in the narcotic space. So I think probably the more powerful intervention in primary care is just monitoring at the prescribing level at the practice. If we can just get the practices to have some time and the inclination and whatever the incentives are to sit down once a month and reflectively look at all of the things that they're doing, because they've got the data's all in there in systems. It's just a matter of, and there are data analytic tools you can stick over the top. They've got to want to value that, and I suspect that's got a more powerful intervention than perhaps going to the dispensing level monitoring. Julie? But it's a good thought.
Julie?
Yeah, just a comment on I don't know if it's a parallel, but in 1998 with the 7-point plan to improve vaccination rates from what were around at the time, reported at least at being 53%. One of the points was to provide incentives for parents and providers. For parents, it was linking family assistance payments to vaccination completion or an exemption. For providers, it was incentivising them to put data onto the new, at the time, Australian Childhood Immunisation Register. So a new register collecting data on all children at the time for their vaccination coverage every time they had a vaccine, but also paying general practice, not other providers, to comply with that. Now that GP incentive system has all but gone now. There's a small incentive remaining, but it was thought at the time among certainly the stakeholders that having that paying attention to your practice data on immunisation rates in this case certainly supported that whole endeavour.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There's a question down the front. I've got one just behind you. Yep.
Hi, my name's Kirsty from the Behavioural Insights team. Thanks to all four of you for your wonderful presentations. My question is for Julie. We saw from those quotations there in your slides just the intense emotionality of the people that you're working with, and can you perhaps elaborate on some of the strategies apart from the evidence-informed communication around how you cope with that, because it's a real character of the work that you do.
Which part is the coping question in relation to?
I guess just my question is around strategies to deal with that high-level emotionality of stakeholders.
Sure. So there's both, I guess there's the clinical communication and the public communication. The public communication environment right now around vaccination is quite toxic. So there's a lot of community anger towards parents who refuse vaccination. And so those parents, we're talking to them in our research at the moment, they are facing stigmatisation along with their children. They do have a responsibility to the community, so you can kind of understand some of that anger, but it's a very fraught environment, and certainly, speaking to the complexities in the public arena is difficult. In the clinical encounter, certainly, and we were talking about this before, acknowledging what's happened to somebody is important, but I think the more that we hear about why people aren't, well, one of the parts of their journey into not vaccinating is having some kind of negative experience with the healthcare system, whether it be an antenatal care, whether it be an adverse event following immunisation, or just something that went wrong after a vaccine was given. And the way that adverse event is managed is sometimes suboptimal. Fortunately, in Australia, we have specialist immunisation services that can see families after that's happened. If the GP doesn't feel that they can deal with the questions, then they can refer the family on, including through telemedicine. But I think our vaccine safety response systems and our adverse events sort of management systems and the way clinicians communicate with people who feel disenfranchised is probably quite important. But really, in the end, these people are hard to change, and we need to focus where there is motivation, there's evidence for change, and then in terms of vaccine refusal, prevent what registered 1.8% of conscientious objectors when we measured it becoming a bigger group through sort of good public communication. So I'm sorry it's not a clear answer there, but it is a very difficult, complex topic. But there is emotion, and I think acknowledging where people are coming from on either side of that debate is important.
We've got one question at the front here and then over to the left, and that would be it, I think.
Thanks all for your wonderful case studies. I'm Ash Donaldson from Tobias, principal at Tobias Human Design Company. And I was wondering if you've been able to unpick, you mentioned that the UK had 3%, you've got 12% here in Australia. One part of the question is, have you been able to unpick why the fourfold win here? And also the difference between the delayed prescription and the graph, why one was more effective than the other.
Yeah, it's hard to assess why without running more trials and to manipulate more things. Just in terms of thinking about the delayed prescription, and what we know is they got different effects. We're not exactly sure if there's a better way to present delayed prescribing that would be more effective than the one we did, so we could continue to experiment with that. In terms of the difference with the UK, I think the critical difference is that we had individual level data, so we could tell a doctor that that particular individual, you individually compare to your peers in this way rather than your clinic does. So that just emphasises the level of personal accountability, I think, in a way that you can't do at the clinic level, where there's a lot of well, it's the practice as a whole that would have to change. I'm just one person in that practice. It's a very different thing. So I think we had that great advantage in this case.
We may have had a higher baseline too. It may have been because...
Could be our CMO also.
Yes, his brand recognition is incredibly good. Yeah. But can I ask, is Dame Sally thinking of picking up the approach that was taken here in Australia? Is it impossible because of the way that their system is structured?
I don't know. I'm meeting in a couple of weeks. So
we'll find out more. We'll follow you on Twitter, Brendan. You can tell us. Question at the front here, probably the last one.
Hal Willoughby, Colossum Consulting and the University of Sydney. So as Julie mentioned, we work together on the vaccination work. I just want to make an observation and then a couple of questions. It seems to me we've got a natural experiment here on stage where one of the behavioural targets Julie's was around helping doctors in their conversations with parents in a sort of instructive way. So defining the problem, I guess, as a behavioural one, but isolating the specific types of conversations that they're having and trying to act in that place. Whereas on your side, Michael and Brendan, you've got a target which is really a bit more broad spectrum to say that, you know, you've said, well, there's a problem, not sure what it is, let's use some social norms to solve it. And if I will, to use a metaphor, you've got sort of a targeted antibiotic and a broad spectrum one. So that's the observation. The question is, what drove you to pick the broader spectrum approach? And the second follow-up then, do you think there's value in the narcotics, as that one's on the horizon, in the narcotics context? Is there value in actually understanding more about the interaction between the doctor and the patient and actually targeting that behaviour as opposed to using a broad spectrum approach?
I don't know if you want to go first.
Well, I think we've tried, you know, a variety of educational approaches. I think that the biggest challenge with GPs is to get their attention. They are so busy and they're so overwhelmed with data that you can try getting them to seminars and getting CPD points and going through all the... But this I think we have been struggling to get traction with GPs in antimicrobial prescribing for a couple of years. We've only just set up an advisory group with the college, and many of the people in the college say, well, our problem isn't the community problem, our safety problem is our individual patient. So it's getting some sense of ownership and accountability, and I think the attraction of this, I mean, that obviously the behavioural team in health and PMC came up with the idea, but it was very attractive to me because we had not been getting any traction, and we wanted to try something that would, you know, have a material impact. Now you can obviously then go and refine it more, but that was the attraction for me.
Yeah, I think that's, in a way, this was low-hanging fruit because the trial had been done elsewhere, had been effective. We knew that the doctors weren't getting this kind of feedback. So we thought this kind of feedback would be useful, and they weren't getting it. We could just immediately provide it and see whether it had an effect. But I think your point is, in all behavioural interventions, like in the ideal academic world, we would spend a lot of time, and Julie has done this with her work, you would spend a lot of time diagnosing the behavioural problem with qualitative work and observation in the field. We'd look at how doctors interact when patients come in with respiratory infections and say, what goes on in this interaction and what is the thing that is likely to lead to overprescribing, and how could an intervention affect that thing and still produce good outcomes for everyone. And there's a range of things it could be. It could be this need to build trust and to provide something. It could be the stress, the time limitations. They could prescribe more at the end of the day than they do at the beginning of the day when they're tired. There could be a whole range of things that you discover during that. And we could still do that work. But we thought that this was low-hanging fruit where a simple intervention might yield immediate results, and we were right.
So I think you need both. These interventions produce, large-scale change. What I'm doing is, the evidence says just communication on its own, as you know, doesn't change people. You have to have other interventions to address opportunity, capability, reminding people and so forth. So yes, you need to motivate people, you need to communicate well, because if you don't have good communication, all the other interventions will fail. You can't take motivation for granted. We've thought a lot about where our intervention around, improving communication with this relatively small group who take a lot of time of GPs and nurses, where does that sit with the overall scheme of things in terms of improving immunisation rates? The evidence says that on its own, it's not going to make a big difference to vaccination rates, but making the vaccination process, which is a really common process for us all, a good process is important, but both for parents and providers, and it will build resiliency in vaccination programs such that if there is a vaccine safety scare, such that if somebody is disenfranchised, that they can have a good communication process there. And in fact, You know, people have said to us in the past, this sort of structure you have around improving vaccination communication, could you take that to antimicrobial resistance? So I think we need both. I think we need a really good understanding, particularly with rich, in-depth qualitative research that complements our understanding of the proportions, where the barriers are, what the issues are, what the user experience is, and how we can tweak that, and also have interventions that produce change at scale on things where there's evidence that it will produce change.
I think Julia's did a fantastic summary, actually, of this entire panel. There's been some really great deep insights from the panel members today, and also some great questions from the floor. We have run out of time, so please join me in thanking Brendan, Michael and Jerril.